Hello, living organisms, and welcome to Biology 3013. From Biology 3012, you should know why we are considered living organisms. So in 3012, we talked about the different properties of life that an organism has to have in order to be considered alive. And then we zoomed in on an individual cell of one of those organisms. And for the majority of the course, we were looking at what are the different components of that cell? We looked at the organelles and what all of their different jobs are, and then we focused on the different processes that are going to occur within those cells that allow for life to be able to exist. Now we're going to take a step back. In Biology 3012, in Biology 3013, we're going to zoom back out to that individual organism level. We're going to look at how all of these different organisms came to be, so we'll focus on evolution for that. Then we're going to take a look at some of the different groups of organisms, some of the different groups of life that there are on Earth, and how we categorize these different forms of life. And then we'll take a look at how these different organisms interact with one another and how they interact with their environment. So there's quite a bit of content throughout this course, and it's quite a bit different than Biology 3012. Hopefully, you guys are going to enjoy it. So let's get started on Chapter 13. This video lecture will look at the first half of Chapter 13. So let's start off with 13.1, looking at the diversity of life. So there's over 1.7 million species of organisms that have been described, meaning that we've found those organisms, we've named those organisms. There are different estimates on how many different species there actually are on Earth. There's a lot more than 1.7 million, but that's just where we're at so far. Regardless, that's a lot of different species. So we have to be able to name those species and categorize them in a way that's not confusing. Let's look at a little example here. If I say, did you see that clip, that skit that Dave just released? And I'm here, I'm like, what? Dave Attenborough? He just did a skit? What are you talking about? And I didn't know, but you're actually talking about Dave Chappelle. Dave Chappelle just released this awesome skit. And so there's confusion because I'm thinking of one Dave, but really you're talking about another Dave. So how can we clear up this confusion? Well, the way that we clear it up is that you'd say, hey, Dave Chappelle, he just released this awesome new skit. So by using his first name and last name, it helps to eliminate some of that confusion. In biology, it's going to be similar. The field that's concerned with naming organisms is called taxonomy. And in taxonomy, there was this guy, Carolus Linnaeus, that came up with this unambiguous naming system. So this naming system is referred to as the Linnaean system after Carolus Linnaeus. And it's a way to name species so that there's no confusion on what particular species you're talking about. Now, the Linnaean system uses a binomial nomenclature. That means a two-part name to it. So if we think of our names, we often have a first name and a last name, and our last name helps to imply some sort of relationship. For example, if I said, all right, we've got some names here and you tell me which one is not related. Clearly it's a little bit more complicated than this, but let's just go with Carrie Everett, Aaron Everett, Zach Everett, Dave Moreland, Troy Everett. Just by listening to those names, we can probably say, well, all of those Everetts, they're probably blood relatives. Whereas that guy with the last name Moreland, he probably wasn't a blood relative to all of those Everetts. So the last name helps to infer a little bit of relationship. The same thing applies to our binomial nomenclature that we use in biology. So the first part of the name is referred to as the genus. And the genus is what's kind of equivalent to our last name. It's a group of organisms that are all related, closely related to one another. Now, in binomial nomenclature, these two-part names are always Latinized, so in Latin. So it makes it a little bit more complicated for us to try to remember. But here, if we look, Panthera is a genus name. You can see it always has an uppercase letter first and the rest are all lowercase. and the word is always italicized. So it has to be uppercase and italicized in order to be considered correct. Now, Panthera, this is the genus of all of the different large cats. So it's going to have species within that genus that are all closely related to one another. So if you think of lions and tigers and leopards, these are all different species that are going to be found within that genus Panthera. But now let's look at the proper scientific names for these other large cats. So let's look at the leopard as an example. The leopard is a species found within the genus Panthera, and its entire name is Panthera pardus. So this is where you need both parts, so it's a two-part name, and combined the genus with this second part. The second part is actually called the specific epithet, but these two names combined together is the species name for that particular organism. So the leopard is referred to as the Panthera pardus. Again, you can see Panthera, uppercase, starts off with an uppercase. The specific epithet, the second part of the name, actually is going to stay lowercase. And it's all italicized, and again, because it's in Latin, it's a little bit confusing, a little bit hard for us to remember. But if I say Panthera pardus, there is no confusion. Anybody who's familiar with leopards, any scientists who are studying them, they know that this is referring to a very particular species. It's not talking about the lion, it's not talking about the tiger, it's only talking about the leopard. All right, so we can see then that the genus is going to have many different species within it. There are larger ways to classify all of these organisms as well. Some of these we learnt about in Biology 3012, but we're going to build on that in Biology 3013. So if we let's start here at the bottom, because at the bottom, we learnt about the different domains of life in Biology 3012. So I'll give you a second. Can you remember how many domains of life there are? Can you remember what the different domains of life are? So all life can be broken down into 3 different domains: the bacteria, the archaea, and the eukarya. Now, if you remember, the bacteria and the archaea are made up of these little prokaryotic cells, and we are going to talk more about them in Biology 3013 as well. And then we have the eukarya, and the eukarya is the largest domain where we have the most diversity within it. And if we go to the to the next level of structure within domains, we have kingdoms. So we looked at how we have different kingdoms within the domain eukarya. The major kingdoms are plants, animals, and fungi. And then we also have this group called the protists, where there's lots of kingdoms within the protists as well. So you can see here how we have this organized structure within this naming system. So at the bottom here, the largest scale is domains, and you go into these smaller groups, and there's going to be fewer and fewer species within them. So we go from domains, there are lots of kingdoms within domains. Within one kingdom, you are going to have multiple phyla, or the single form of that is a phylum. If you look at each individual phylum, you will have different classes within it, which in each class, you'll have different orders. Within each order, you will have different families, and within each family, you are going to have different, the plural form of a genus is genera, so you'll have multiple genera, and then within each one of those, within each genus, you will have multiple species. So organisms of similar species are all going to be within the same genus. And then if you have two closely related genera, well then they would be found within the same family. If you have closely related families, they're going to be found within the same order, etc., all the way down to your kingdom level. So if we think of this classification when we're looking at humans, we know that the species name for humans is Homo sapiens. Homo sapiens. So just by knowing that species name, it should tell you what the genus is that we fall within. So the first part of Homo sapiens would be the genus. So we would fall within the genus Homo. And then if we continued that down, we'd actually be in the family Hominidae. This is species that walk upright. We would be within the order of primates, who often have kind of a higher level of intelligence. We would be within the class of mammals. Mammals distinguished for being for having mammary glands, or for the ability to be able to nurse their offspring. Then we'd go down into the phylum, which for humans we are chordates. So in the phylum Chordata, and we have a spinal cord. That's one of the key characteristics for it. And then we're within the kingdom Animalia, or from the animals, and then within the domain Eukarya. So all of those organisms that have this eukaryotic cell. Some of that might sound familiar to you from Biology 3012, but if not a problem. Within this course, we're really going to start here again, and we're going to work our way down, particularly to that phyla level. So we're going to look at the three main domains of life. We'll look at some of the general characteristics of bacteria and archaea, and then we're really going to focus in on the eukarya for 3 chapters. And within the eukarya, we're going to look at some of the major kingdoms, and then we're going to look at those major kingdoms and look at some of the major phyla within those kingdoms. So that's going to give us a better idea of the different diversity that there is in life. All right, let's continue along here now. So we know that there's this huge diversity of life. Well, how did this diversity come to be? How are there so many different forms of life? Well, in order to understand that, we have to take a look at Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin wrote on the origin of species by means of natural selection, and he published it on November 24th, 1859. And it's within this book that it really outlines how all of this diversity came to be. So we're going to take a look in this chapter of what does Charles Darwin mean by natural selection? What is that? And how does that allow for different species to be able to evolve? Well, before we focus in on Charles Darwin and natural selection, let's take a look at what was going on before 1859. So prior to Charles Darwin, there was this idea of fixed species. And what that means is that the species do not change over time. So why did we have this idea of fixed species? There's a couple of reasons. One of the reasons is Aristotle. Aristotle, who was a Greek philosopher, he was well respected for his vast intellect. And so Aristotle, he said that species, they don't change over time. They are always fixed. And because Aristotle was really smart, everybody else said, yes, okay, you're right. Species, they do not change over time. They are always fixed. Another reason why it was commonly believed that species did not change over time was because of a literal interpretation of the Bible. This is where I have to insert my kind of blanket warning statement for the semester. In this course, we are only going to be looking at evolution. We will not be looking at other ways of trying to make sense of the diversity of life around us. So one of these other ways is through religion. And with religion, it's saying that God has created species in their present day form. We will not be looking at religion and the details of religion throughout this course. So we are only going to be focusing in on evolution and how evolution occurred to be able to explain the diversity of life. All right, so back to the slide here. The idea of fixed species, so it's saying pre-Darwin, the common belief was that these species did not change. Well then, if species didn't change, then why were there some of these fossils that we were taking a look at, or that naturalists were taking a look at, and they couldn't explain? So for example here, we've got this fossil here that was nicknamed the snake stone, and it was commonly believed that this was the fossil of a snake all curled up, except all of these fossils were always missing the snake's head. So naturalists started to say, okay, well, that's really bizarre. Why do we have this fossil of a snake with no head? And eventually they started to say, well, maybe it's not a snake. Maybe it's from some species that no longer lives. So from an extinct species. And indeed, I'll mention it that these naturalists were right. This snake stone is actually a fossil from an extinct group of cephalopods. So cephalopods we'll talk about. It's a group of species that also include the octopuses and the squids. And in particular, this group here were called the ammonites. So it was a marine species. So it's not a snake, it's very different from a snake, and it doesn't have a head here, which is why you always had these fossils without the head on it. So naturalists, by seeing some of these fossils, they started to say, okay, well, are we sure that species don't change over time? Well then, as naturalists continued to kind of question this, more and more fossils started to get discovered. Eventually, in the early 1800s, this fossil here of an ichthyosaur skull was discovered. And that's when naturalists were really starting to say, okay, this is nothing like anything that we see now. This has to be some form of extinct species. So species, they must not be fixed. They must change somehow over time. That being said, they weren't too sure how they change over time. They said, yes, I think they do change, but how do they change? Why do they change? Nobody knew. Well, then now let's enter Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck. And he was another naturalist, a French naturalist, and he said that life evolves, life changes over time, and he was the first one to really say that they change over time, and he speculated on how they change. And in particular, he said they change from the inheritance of acquired traits. Acquired traits means traits that an organism acquires or traits that an organism gets throughout its lifetime. So his kind of famous example was, if you think of giraffes, we know that giraffes have a really long neck. And he said that a giraffe's neck is really long because throughout the lifespan of a giraffe, that giraffe is stretching up its neck all the time. And because it's stretching up its neck, slowly its neck is gradually just growing a little bit over time. And so because the mom giraffe was stretching its neck out all the time, well then now a baby giraffe is going to have a really long neck too. We know now that that is not correct. Another example here to help explain it is that if you picture a carpenter again back in the 1800s, you have this carpenter that's hammering away at nails all day. He's using his bicep all of the time. Well, then that carpenter is going to have a very strong bicep. So a strong biceps that he acquired through his lifetime. Well, now, because that carpenter has strong biceps, when he has children, his children are going to have very strong biceps too. Again, we know this is not correct. Little baby carpenter is not going to pop out all jacked up and have really strong biceps. But this was important because it was the first naturalist that really tried to cement an idea on how these species are he tried to propose this idea of how species are changing over time. So it really set the stage for Darwin to enter. All right, so let's take a look at Charles Darwin and the origin of species. Charles was born in England in 1809, and as a boy he was very interested in nature. But his dad, who was a doctor, he saw no future as a naturalist. So he said, Darwin, you are going to med school. And Darwin went, but he hated med school. He thought it was boring, and he decided to leave med school, and he wanted to become a minister. So he started to do his BA degree, And within his degree, he was doing a couple of biology courses. He thought these biology courses were fascinating, and he was doing a botany class, so a plant class, and his teacher actually recommended to Darwin that he accompany this geographer, Captain Robert Fitzroy. Fitzroy was going to travel around the world trying to survey or map out all of the different continents. And so, lo and behold, Darwin jumps on board the ship referred to as the HMS Beagle. And we can see on this map here where the Beagle charted. And as Captain Fitzroy was working on his maps, Darwin was out making observations, collecting specimens, and really working on trying to figure out what life he sees where and what are some of the different patterns that he sees. And in particular, Darwin saw through all of his travels that geographic proximity is a better predictor of relationships among organisms than a similarity of environment. So what does that actually mean? That means that if you take plants and animals and you look at them within South America, if you look at a temperate region of South America and a tropical region of South America, Darwin would have thought that the plants and animals in those different climates would be quite different from one another. But he found that the plants and animals that were within the same continent, they were actually pretty similar to one another. They resembled one another. And what confused him more was that if you took the plants and animals from a kind of a temperate region of South America and compared those to a temperate region of Europe, so a similar climate, Darwin would have thought that the plants and animals that lived in a similar climate, even if it was on different continents, he would have thought the animals with a similar climate would more closely resemble one another. But they didn't. Those that lived more closely together, despite the environment they were in, those organisms looked a lot more alike. He also saw that fossils, they were similar to living species, but just with a few differences. So he was really intrigued by this. And then the Galapagos Islands, the famous Galapagos Islands. Darwin took a look at the different species on the Galapagos Islands, so this series of islands made from volcanic rock on the Pacific side of South America. And what he saw was that there were species in the Galapagos Islands that he didn't see anywhere else in the world. But they were similar to species that he saw in South America, which was the closest continent. So it started to get him to wonder, okay, well, why do I only see these species here, like this aquatic or this marine iguana? Why do I only see this marine iguana in the Galapagos Islands, but not in South America? And why does this aquatic iguana look very similar to this terrestrial iguana that's found within South America? So he started to wonder, okay, well, maybe this marine iguana is somehow closely related to this terrestrial iguana from nearby South America. So the Galapagos Islands really just started getting him seeing some patterns of similarities here between organisms. And then another question he had was, well, he saw that on each of these volcanic islands within the Galapagos, they each had their own distinct species of giant tortoise. So he said, well, why do all of these different islands have their own species of tortoise? So he really started to think, okay, well, maybe these species, they are all related to one another and they just change a little bit over time. Well, then he started to say, well, how do they change over time? And he started to do some research on it, and he read this book called Principles of Geology by Charles Lyell. And this was talking about how Earth, the ground that we stand on that seems so rock solid, that seems so permanent, that even that Earth is sculpted by gradual geological processes, meaning that even the Earth that we stand on gradually changes over time. And Darwin actually witnessed this powerful natural force on Earth's surface himself when at one point he experienced an earthquake on the coastline of Chile, and it actually raised that coastline of Chile in this particular location by almost a meter. So he said, well, wow, if the Earth's surface that seems so permanent, if it can change over time, well, then maybe the same concept can apply to life. Maybe life can change over time. So Darwin, he was examining his species, and he concluded that species that are living today have descended from an ancestral form. And he coined this term descent with modification. So these organisms or these species, they have descended from one another, and they become gradually modified over time depending on the environment that it's in. So he came up with this idea called natural selection. What's that actually saying? Natural selection is saying individuals with certain inherited traits are more likely to survive and reproduce than are individuals with other traits. Meaning that if you have a particular trait that allows you to survive better in your environment, maybe you're faster and you're not going to get eaten, maybe you're better at getting food, whatever that trait is, if it allows you to survive and have more offspring, well then, because it's an inherited trait, it means that it's going to be handed down to the offspring. So if this trait allows you to survive, have offspring, well then you're handing that trait down to your offspring. And so this was the mechanism for how life could change over time. Well, life is changing over time depending on the environment that these different species are in and what inherited trait is best suited for that environment. I just want to point out, we can see that this idea of natural selection is similar to what we talked about with Lamarck, where you had this change, the passing down of traits over time, but there's this key difference here of inherited traits. With Lamarck, remember, he said that you're passing down acquired traits. So traits that you're gaining through your lifetime, like those strong biceps. With Darwin, rather than looking at acquired traits or traits that you're getting through your lifetime, it's saying these traits that you're born with. If you're born with these traits and it's advantageous in the environment, then you'll survive and reproduce. If you don't have these traits, well then maybe you're not going to survive until you reproduce. So maybe you don't have offspring, and as a result, that trait isn't going to persist in the environment because it's not advantageous to have that trait. So the key difference between Lamarck and Darwin was what type of traits they were looking at. Inherited traits, so traits that are passed down from offspring, versus Lamarck saying acquired traits. All right, so let's take a look at a little timeline here. This timeline, I just want to point out a couple of things on here. We saw 1809 was when Charles Darwin was born. 1831 to 1836 was a few years he was out on the HMS Beagle. And then it took him a long time after he came back to really analyze his specimens and really come up with this idea of natural selection. In 1844, Darwin finally writes his essay, so on the origin of species. But if you look here on this timeline, way over here, 1859 is when Darwin finally publishes that essay on the origin of species that's describing how species are changing over time, and it's because of the inheritance of these characteristics that are most suited to the environment. So there's always all kinds of speculation on why on earth did it take so long for Darwin to actually publish that manuscript. Some people say that it's because Darwin was just a very thorough scientist and he really wanted to double check his work and make sure that he had all of his I's dotted and his T's crossed. Some people say that it's because of religion was so predominant at the time that he feared that he would be ridiculed by his more religious peers. And some people said that it wasn't until we have Alfred Russell here, or Alfred Russel Wallace, pardon me, that enters the scene. And some say that Wallace really helped to give Darwin the confidence to publish his own manuscript. So Wallace in 1858, he sends his own manuscript to Darwin that describes a very similar process. So Darwin said, okay, well, if other people are seeing the same pattern, they're coming up with these same ideas, well then maybe it's true, maybe it will become commonly accepted. So then Darwin publishes his manuscript and the rest is history. So we don't often hear about Alfred Russel Wallace, but perhaps he did have an influence on Darwin publishing his manuscript, so thank you, Wallace, for your part in history as well. All right, so what did Darwin's manuscript say? Well, he was making two main points within it. The first one, organisms inhabiting Earth today are not fixed. They have descended from ancestral species, and that they have accumulated some modifications over time depending on the environment that they were living in. And then he said point two was that natural selection is the how. Natural selection is the main mechanism of how these differences were going to accumulate over time. And we'll take a closer look at that later in this chapter and in our next chapter as well. All right, so what kind of evidence is there for evolution? Let's take a look at 5 key points that support evolution. These are the 5 key points of evidence for evolution. Let's take a look at each one of them, starting with the fossil record. Let's take a look at what fossils actually are first. We talked about them already, and most people are somewhat familiar with them. So they're imprints or remains of organisms that lived in the past. And we talked about them in the context of naturalists looking at fossils and trying to make sense of them, saying it looks like these living species, but with a few differences. So we started to say that these naturalists were looking at these fossils and realizing that maybe species aren't fixed. Now, when we think of fossils, most of us are thinking of this type of fossil here, where it's the fossilized skeleton of different organisms that lived in the past. But there are other types of fossils as well. You can get imprints that were left by these organisms. If you are super lucky, you can also get fossils that are preserved in different ways rather than being mineralized. So these fossils like this are mineralized and harden over time. But sometimes you can get the soft tissue of organisms as well. This is much more rare, but in this example here, you can see an insect. Normally you wouldn't get an insect fossil like this because the insect is much softer and it would just decay. But in this case here, this insect was trapped in tree resin. And then this tree resin hardened over time, and now you have this beautiful little insect fossil. So it's a way that you can preserve some of the soft parts of that organism as well. And so you can see fossils of some organisms that you don't often see in the fossil record. You can also get fossils that have been, rather than hardened and mineralized over time, you can get fossils that have been preserved in ice for time as well. So for example, you can get some mammoth tusks or even parts of the actual mammoth body itself preserved in ice. And then you can inspect those fossils to look for similarities between those organisms and species that are living now. So then when you inspect all of these different fossils, you can put together a fossil record. So this is looking at the sequence of fossils as they appear in rock layers. So you can see here within the rock, we've got different strata or different layers. And the newer layers are going to be on the top. So the fossils up here will be the youngest fossils, the ones that have lived the most recently. And toward the bottom is going to be the older fossils, the one that has lived more distantly, longer in the past. So you can see through these different layers how fossils have changed over time. So let's take a look at that. We talked about whales. Whales have descended from this four-legged hoofed ancestor that was actually terrestrial. So they didn't always live in water. They actually came from a species that lived on land. Now, by looking just at this initial species here and comparing it to whales, you say, well, are they really ancestors? They don't look a lot alike. But by looking through the fossil record, you can find these transitional forms. And this is just showing a couple of the transitional forms here. But you can see how these species, they look similar to one another. And if you look at this hind leg structure in particular, you can see how the hind legs here, they look similar, but they're changing over time. And even our modern day cetaceans, but whales are one example of cetaceans. Also within this group, you have the dolphins and the porpoises. But all of those cetaceans have descended from this four-legged hoofed animal. And whales now, they still have just a little structure there, but a little bone left over as their hind leg structure. They don't have hind legs anymore, but they had that bone because their ancestors had that hind leg bone. And you can see that more easily when you look in the fossil record and you see these transitional forms and how these species accumulate differences over time. So that's how the fossil record supports evolution. The next example is homologies. Homologies are similarities in traits that you're going to see because those species both got that trait from a common ancestor. So if we look at an example of homologies here, let's again look at the bone structure, because looking at the bone structure gives a good idea of how similar species can be because of the kind of details of the anatomy of these bones. So if we look here, this is showing a human forelimb or arm. This is showing a cat forelimb, a bat forelimb, a whale forelimb, and a bat forelimb or bat wing. And so all of these you can see highlighted in the different colors. These forelimbs, although if you look on the outside and at a human arm, a cat leg, a whale flipper, and a bat wing, they look very different from one another on the outside. But when you look closely at the anatomy of them, you can see that they all have a similar bone structure. They all have the same humerus. The humerus is a different size, it's a different shape, because it's going to have a different function depending on the environment that these organisms live in. But they all have the same bone structure. They all have this radius and ulna, these carpals and metacarpals. They all have the same bone structure, even though on the outside they look very different from one another. And at this point, they all have very different functions And the reason that they all have this similar appearance when you look at the details is because they are all homologous to one another. They are homologies. And what that means is that they all have this similar structure because they all descended ultimately from the same common ancestor. Humans, we share a common ancestor with all of these organisms here. And we all have this bone structure because our common ancestor had that similar bone structure. So we all have that bone structure because we all descended from the same common ancestor. So that's what homologies are, looking for these similarities and these similarities that are explained because of common ancestry. Let's look at the third point of evidence for evolution. Molecular biology, and by far this is the one that's the most commonly used today, and this is saying that you are looking at the molecular basis of genes and gene expression to support evolution. What that means is that you are looking for similarities in the genes or similarities in the DNA of all of these different organisms. And the more similar the DNA is, the more closely related these species must be. If we just look at humans first, if we say, okay, well, I'm going to look at everybody on my street, and everybody on my street, we all have a lot of different characteristics. We have different colored hair, we have different heights, different weights, different shades of skin color, different eye color. All of these differences that we have, but if we look at our DNA, we share 99.9% of the same DNA. That's a lot of similarities. If we look at humans and chimpanzees, we share 99%. If we even look at humans and cats, if we look at the morphology, if we look at the outside and the characteristics of us, we don't look very similar to cats. But if we look at our DNA, we share 90% of our DNA with cats. If you look at, let's go humans and chickens. Humans and chickens, you don't think we look very close to one another, but we still have 60% of the same DNA. Even bananas, we share 50% of our DNA with bananas or banana trees. So all of these forms of life, they all look very different from one another, but they have the same molecular basis. They have very similar amounts of DNA, and the more DNA that these organisms have in common, the more closely related they are to one another. We can even go a step further to that and say that by looking at molecular biology is really providing strong proof that all forms of life, every single living organism on Earth, is related in some capacity, because we all talk at the molecular level, we all speak the same language. We all use these nucleotides that are found in DNA and RNA. Because we use those same nucleotides, we must have got that language somehow. We must have got those nucleotides somehow, well, from a common ancestor. Our common ancestor had these nucleotides, and that has been passed down to all forms of life. In addition to that, in Biology 3012, we talked about the genetic code. If you remember, that was the kind of table that we compared to a French-English dictionary. That genetic code was looking at how the different nucleotides would code for particular amino acids. And then the sequence of those amino acids would make the different proteins. Well, all forms of life have the same genetic code. They all read the same sequence of nucleotides and plug in the same amino acid. So because they're all speaking that same molecular language, it means that we all got it from somewhere. We're probably all closely related to one another, and we all have this same molecular basis because of our common ancestor. Proof number 4 is vestigial structures. Vestigial structures are really neat. These are remnants of features that served an important function in an organism's ancestors, but now they might not have any function at all. So for example, when we were looking at that picture that was showing the transitional form of species that descended down to whales, we saw that the hind leg bones of whales still exist. There's still this little bone. Let me scroll up to it here. Whales still have this little hind leg bone. They don't have a hind leg, but they do have a hind leg bone. Why do they have that bone? Well, they have that bone because it hasn't evolved out yet, basically. Maybe 100,000 years from now or 1,000,000 years from now, maybe these whales don't have this bone anymore. But at this point in time, they still have that bone because their common ancestors had these hind leg bones. They have changed over time. This bone here serves no function now, but they have it because of the structure of their common ancestor. So vestigial structures, remnants that served an important function in an organism's past, but they don't have a function now. Even if you think of humans, try to think of some vestigial structures of humans. We can see here goosebumps is one of them. So goosebumps is more important in our more hairy ancestors because goosebumps allowed us to be able to raise that hair to create a little bit of insulation on our bodies to be able to help keep us warm. So when our ancestors, our hairy ancestors got cold, they got goosebumps. That made a little extra layer of insulation and it helped to warm them up. Now we aren't overly hairy compared to our ancestors. So now our hair stands up when we get goosebumps, but it's not creating a nice layer of insulation for us because we simply don't have enough hair. Can you think of any other Can you think of any other vestigial structures of humans? Maybe some of you have listed off the tailbone. Another common example is wisdom teeth. So even humans, we have vestigial structures, these structures that served an important function in our past, but we no longer need. Our tailbone, we don't have a tail anymore. What do we need a tailbone for? We only have it because our ancestors had a tailbone that supported their actual tail. Now that we don't have tails, that tailbone is a vestigial structure. Lastly, homologies in embryos. Sometimes when you're looking at similarities in the adult form, it's hard to see these homologies or these similarities due to common ancestry. But sometimes when you look at the embryo, it's a lot easier to be able to see these similarities. Well, I already mentioned that chickens and humans, we share 60% of the same DNA. We are related to one another. We have homologies with chickens. If you look at an adult chicken and you look at an adult human, it's going to be pretty hard to see those homologies, those similarities. But if you look at the embryos of chickens and the embryos of humans, well, now you see, well, wait a minute, they don't look overly different from one another. They both have these similar pharyngeal pouches. They both have this post-anal tail that we'll talk more about later in the course as well. So there are similarities at the embryological state or within the embryos that you don't necessarily see in the adult form. So by looking at these homologies in embryos, it helps to be able to understand relationships as well. So again, all proof of evolution. Okay, so if we have all of these different forms of life and we're all connected, we're all related in some way, well, how can we visualize that? The way that Darwin did it in his manuscript was through an evolutionary tree. So this was within Darwin's manuscript, and it showed number one here would be the common ancestor for all forms of life. And every time you have this branching, it's when that common ancestor eventually broke off into two different species. And we'll talk more about that in our next chapter as well. So every time you have this branching, you have two different species. And then ultimately at the ends of these branches, at the tips of these twigs, is where you would have the living organisms, the living species. And the more close these species are on that evolutionary tree, the closer they are to one another means the more closely related they are to one another. So these two species here would be more closely related to each other than they would be to a species on the tree way over here. So that's the way Darwin visualized the whole history of life, and that's the way that's commonly used for biologists still today. So we use these evolutionary trees, and the branching sequence is going to show how evolution, how all these different species evolved from one another. So it's going to reflect how similar these species are to one another. If we look at an example of an evolutionary tree here, and these are also called phylogenetic trees, if we look at an example here, we can see that we have just a few different groups of organisms here. So this tree isn't all the way down to the species level, but we've got some groups of organisms and they're all related to one another. you can look at this evolutionary tree and determine which two species are the most closely related. So let's take a look at how you can read this tree. Each of these numbers here are called the nodes, and the nodes are when you started with one branch and it broke off into two different branches. At each one of those nodes, there is a common ancestor. So common ancestor number 6 eventually diverged to become two different groups of organisms, the ostriches and the hawks and the other birds. And then you'd actually have a little phylogenetic tree here that would show all of the different species of birds and how they are all related to one another if you really zoomed in on that tree. So the numbers here are the nodes that represent a common ancestor. So if we look at number 3 here as an example, common ancestor number 3 diverged to become mammals, and it also became common ancestor number 4. Common ancestor number 4 then diverged to become lizards and snakes, and it became common ancestor number 5, etc., the whole way through. Now, how do you determine where some of these species go on the tree? Well, you're going to look for homologies, or those similarities in characteristics. So ostriches, hawks, and other birds, they are grouped together here on the tree because of the homology of having feathers. So feathers is the homology. Everything to the right of that homology is going to have feathers. So if I asked you to look on this tree, and if I said, let's look at lizards and snakes, are lizards and snakes more closely related to mammals, or are they more closely related to crocodiles? When you first look at the tree, you're like, well, they're really close. They're right next to each other, so they must be the same. But what you actually have to do is look for the most recent shared common ancestor. So what that means, lizards and snakes, when do they share a common ancestor with crocodiles? Well, let's go back on the tree. Crocodiles, lizards, and snakes, they go back right here. Number 4 would be where they shared a common ancestor. Well, now let's go back to lizards and snakes and compare it to mammals. Let's go back through the tree. Mammals, lizards, and snakes, their most recent common ancestor is number 3. That's more distantly, that's further in the past. 4 is closer to now, closer to the tips of the branches, which is present day. So because lizards and crocodiles share a more recent common ancestor than lizards and mammals, it means that lizards and crocodiles are more closely related to one another than mammals and lizards are. So you're always looking for that more recent common ancestor. And you can kind of think of it as if they have a common ancestor that's closer to now, well, then that means that they've had less time to accumulate these differences. The further back an ancestor is, the more time there has been for the different species to evolve, so to accumulate differences over time. So the species that are most closely related to get together are the ones that are going to have the most recent common ancestor on the tree. So if I asked which two groups on this tree are the two most closely related to one another, the answer is going to be, again, to look at the common ancestor. So ostriches, hawks, and other birds, they're the ones that share the most recent common ancestor. So they are the two species or the two groups that are most closely related to one another on this tree. So again, these trees are going to be determined by using homologies, but we're not only going to be looking for anatomical homologies, so similarities in how these organisms appear, but you're also looking for molecular homologies, so similarities in the DNA. And nowadays, most of the time, these trees are created by looking at the percentage similarity in the DNA. So if we consider that whale evolution again, we saw that whales, they surprisingly came from this four-legged hooved ancestor, and in particular, it was a cloven hooved ancestor. That cloven is just referring to the hoof that is divided into two kind of toes. So that hoof, that divided hoof. So whales came from this ancestor that had this divided hoof. So we know that from looking at the fossil record that whales are closely related to these terrestrial mammals, and in particular these terrestrial hooved mammals. But where exactly does it fall on the tree? Scientists used DNA evidence to figure that out. And what they found within the DNA evidence is that whales and hippos actually shared a lot of DNA with one another. And that helped them to conclude that hippos and whales both evolved from the same that cloven hoofed mammal. They both evolved from that same ancestor. And so they belong here on the tree with these other hooved terrestrial organisms. All right, so that is evidence of evolution. Now we're going to end for today, and for our next video lecture, we will pick up with section 13.4, looking more at natural selection and some of the details associated with natural selection. And we'll also take a look at some other ways that populations can evolve over time. So that's it for today. Happy studying, and please, as always, send me an email if you are having any difficulties with the content.